Hall writes, very interestingly, once Hitler and his deputies assumed near omnipotent authority over the machinery of the German state in the mid-1930s, the reintroduction of slavery would become an important means of integrating the Nazi defense of capitalism with the regime's racist preoccupations. As the military-industrial complex of Hitlerian Germany gathered momentum in its bid for global dominance, a host of Nazi decrees began the process of making slaves of many millions of Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, and others. It is estimated that the Nazi regime enslaved between 8 million and 12 million individuals. These slaves provided cheap labor for literally thousands of companies. Some of these enterprises continued as integral components of the superpower's military-industrial complex. The corporate exploiters of Hitlerian slavery included Volkswagen, Ford, Werk, Siemens, and Daimler-Benz. The most notorious exploiter of slave labor was a consortium of chemical enterprises known as IG Farben. The amalgam of interrelated businesses has been described as the corporate headquarters of the industrial force behind Hitler's Third Reich. IG Auschwitz, so that's interesting, you have IG Auschwitz, so it's like Auschwitz with a brand name, corporate profiteers basically of exploiting human beings, which still goes on today, was prominent among IG Farben's many commercial enterprises in the military-industrial complex that briefly dominated Europe during the apogee of Hitler's career. Auschwitz got its name from the Germanified pronunciation of Oswiecim. The small Polish town of Oswiecim was strategically located in a region rich with coal mines, railway links, and ample resources of fresh water. It became the nexus for one of the most notorious displays of industrialized ruthlessness in all recorded history. I continue. The IG Farben conglomerate has a prominent place in the history of capitalism extension on the commercial, technological, political, and military frontiers of globalization. As the basis of a case study, this international enterprise stands in a class of its own for the light it sheds on the ascendance of the world's dominant military-industrial complex. IG Farben's origins go back to 1903, when Karl Duisberg travelled from Germany to New York to establish a US subsidiary of the Bayer Corporation. This is really interesting. So then Professor Hall carries on later on. Among IG Farben's business partners were Imperial Chemical and Shell Oil in Great Britain, and in the United States, Ford, General Motors, DuPont, United Carbide, Dow Chemical, and Texaco. So if you follow the money, you'll see where you end up. You end up with a small cabal of oligarchs who want to exploit human beings in the most lucrative way possible, and in World War II, as today, enslaving people was the most lucrative way of doing that because you don't have to pay them anything and you don't have to look after them. You just exploit them like slaves. You work them like rats until they can no longer profit you. That's the most overt and explicit form of class warfare. There's different varieties, but this is clearly one of the most pernicious ones. And so also merged with these interests was J.P. Morgan and Company, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which formed the basics for ExxonMobil, which is currently the world's richest and most thoroughly globalized corporate entity. So, I mean, it goes on and on. I mean, this is outrageous. So, even Hall alleges that with their creative accounting, the Wall Street bankers were able to re-engineer in their own interests the masses of credit and debt inherited from the First World War. So it gets even more nefarious. Hall carries on. Like the steel and electricity cartels integral to the structure of the Third Reich, the institutional shape of IG Farben was heavily influenced by the leading figures in a number of Wall Street firms who succeeded in privatizing the scheme of war reparations of the Treaty of Versailles. With their creative accounting, the Wall Street bankers were able to re-engineer in their own interests the masses of credit and debt inherited from the First World War. So what you actually have here, you have the bankers in Wall Street, who obviously have a vested interest in the growth of corporations who profit from war, because they're, two sides of the same coin, right? They're the Wall Street firms. Basically setting up Germany as a kind of laboratory for shock doctrine, as a laboratory like they did in Chile with the Chilean fascism later on, as a kind of not only a bulwark against Soviet-style communism, which was obviously an inherent threat to them, but also as a kind of place where you could sort of ruin through debts imposed through this ridiculous Treaty of Versailles, which would then, according to this author, and even, whose whole book is dedicated to this topic, which is this book Conjuring Hitler: How Britain and America Made the Third Reich, by Professor Preparata, who's at the University of Southern California and the University of Washington, professor of political economy. And so basically you have these bankers setting up Germany, realizing it's in their interest not only to have a right-wing government emerge, which was also, he goes into how that was being funded. Actually, you had extreme right-wing parties being encouraged, so you'd have this because there was this fear in Anglo-America of Russia and Germany getting together. That would be the last thing they wanted. And so Professor Hall deals with this, quite bravely, because I could draw on, what I would call the kind of establishment history. This book, which I read in a history of Germany seminar class, and I was just really shocked how this one professor, she says something really really just took me aback, because I sort of know a little bit about this history, and this is the real establishment version of history. And she basically says that this is all untrue. And this is Jill Stevenson, and it's an essay in this, and needless to say, she has barely any citations. She has 21 citations for 21 pages, whereas Professor Hall, I worked out, he has 3 citations for every 1 page, so he has triple the citations that this scholar offers. But this woman, Jill Stevenson, and she's written this, The Rise of Nazis, Sonderweg or Spanner in the Works. The Rise of Nazis, Sonderweg or Spanner in the Works. And she basically is, it's a historiographic essay, but she makes a very curious comment for me, which really, I think, illustrates the importance of Professor Hall's soon-to-be published text. So Jill Stevenson opines, the mainstream Marxist view of Hitler as a lackey of big capital perhaps found support from one major businessman, Tyson, who entitled his memoirs I Paid Hitler, and that's in the Preparata book too. But it is not a view that has recently been seriously entertained by more than the occasional scholar outside the Soviet bloc. So she's basically whitewashing, and her whole thesis is that, Nazism is basically to blame on the middle classes, as if there was nobody pulling Hitler's strings. And I think this is one thing that Professor Hall wants to deal with, and that's the concept of kind of like Nazism, fascism, Hitlerian capitalism, a kind of historical aberration. You get this kind of Madison Avenue, this Hollywood depiction of the Nazis, and it's very sort of the other, right? Isn't this odd? Isn't this strange? Isn't this, how could humanity sink to those depths? But if you look at the history, the United States and Germany are inextricably linked. And I'm talking about Nazi Germany. US corporations, war profiteer conglomerates, who constitute the contemporary military-industrial complex, are completely interwoven and complicit in the Nazi genocide against Slavs and Jews and Gypsies and homosexuals and communists. And therefore, dealing with that and dealing with the idea that the Nazis aren't this sort of other, this aberration, reprehensible as they were, but they were actually just a forerunner to the new fighter against communism after World War II, after 1945, which was, of course, the United States, who kind of took over from being the bulwark against communism, Soviet-style communism. So Hitler was kind of a laboratory for these larger forces at play, for the Wall Street bankers, for the British bankers in the City of London, and so on. And that author doesn't want to deal with that, Jill Stevenson. And it really shows, if you ask me, a kind of a vacuum in the historiography of the establishment, the traditional historians, who don't want to deal with certain aspects of World War II. It's a very gate-kept field, historical field, and it's a great it's a great mistake, because it's actually letting a lot of people off the hook.